Welcome. Welcome, Sabbath Collective family. You're on Facebook Live. Sabbath Shalom. Welcome you to another Sabbath celebration. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Bible, our faith, and social justice. And we also have some of the AKC family is here as well. It's good to do it at someone else's home, because when you do that, you can have some people here. So thank God for them. So I'm not going to be before you too long, only for about 30 to 40 minutes. We'll see how it works out and see what the level of engagement is. But let me say this. You can't escape social justice at this point. And before I get started, just want to take you back to December of 2016, when I was actually on a cruise with my wife, December 20th, 2016 to be exact, at 11 p.m. We're on our way to our room, and we decided to stop and get some pastries and or some tea and some pizza. So my wife actually had paused for a minute, and a couple asked her to actually sit with them. And I didn't know what they were engaged in, of course, because I was over there trying to get some additional food before I went to bed. But nonetheless, I did join the couple. And when I sat down, I shook the guy's hand, he extended his hand, he stated his name was Joe. And I said, my name is Randy, instead of Randall. I just made it easy. But it was interesting what happened, the next question out of his mouth. He asked me, so what's the deal about Black Lives Matter? Or so what's the deal about Black Lives Matter? And I paused. I said, did he actually say what I thought he said? Because I just met him. He didn't ask me about the weather. He didn't ask me about how the cruise is going. His first question was, so what about Black Lives Matter? Mind you, Joe is about 60, 65, possibly 70 years old. He's a white male. So what I told him, I said, when we say Black Lives Matter, we do not say other lives don't. It's a matter of when we interact with the police, that the police generally get off because of the presumption of justification, and they generally aren't held accountable or culpable for their actions. He went to argue with me. I told him, sir, if I'm going to engage you, that is fact. This will not be an argument, this will be a conversation. So even on a cruise, in the middle of the ocean, on December 20th at 11 p.m. that night, I met Joe. The conversation went on for 30 minutes, and it was more about social justice issues. So tonight we're going to engage you, the audience, and anyone else that chimes in after this to see the video. But let's start with the first slide. If you look at the first slide, this kind of reminds me of Andre. And the reason why I say that, if you notice what she's stating, and I'll read it, says, she's holding a post to this young lady, and it says, telling me that I'm obsessed with talking about racism in America is like telling me I'm obsessed with swimming when I'm drowning. And if you notice, Andre keeps getting this constant refrain that he talks about racism far too much. But here with this young lady here, she is stating exactly what Andre really feels, that this is part of the process. Does justice look like her? Does justice look like me? Does justice look like Ryan or Anita? Let's talk about that. Next slide, please. So you see in this slide, this is like a flow chart, but it's in a circular motion. It basically has conceptually what social justice will look like. I'm not going to read through all of these, but at the end, if you chime in and you want the actual PowerPoint, let me know. You could actually read through the whole chart. But it's basically, the first part says perception of malfunction or injustice in system. So first you'll have to define that, what that may be, right? Then you move on to identification of others wanting to fix the system, right? Then you go to decision to organize as a group to correct the system. It is about 12 or 13 steps there. But again, we already jumped to social justice without actually talking about justice. So I want to step back for a minute. We're going to talk about justice. Next slide. Here, before we even get into justice, we talk about social justice. It covers a gamut of things. It covers global income disparities, human rights, homelessness, diversity, access to food, poverty. It's broadly defined. It can be any or all of these things, depending upon your level of interest, your level of engagement, of course, your level of commitment. Next slide. But here, let me step back and talk about justice. If I ask the 5 people in this living room, what does justice mean? You'll probably get 5 different answers. And they all may be similar, but somewhat different. So when you look at justice, we need to discuss it in 4 major points. The first one being power. And it states, power Power involves the exercise of legitimate power, whether to arbitrate between conflicting claims, to implement social benefits, to enforce legal obligations, or to impose suitable sanctions, right? So we're not talking about the show power that everybody watch on cable. This is actually legitimate power in which people could actually exercise. They're going to arbitrate between two conflicting groups, if not more, and they're going to actually, be able to actually help them or aid them or even benefit them in some particular way because they're in positions of authority. The next concept is equity. We always talk about things being balanced, equal rights, equal treatment. And so that's one of the concepts of justice. Are people being treated fairly? And who's going to be the arbitrator to make sure people are being treated fairly? And so we're going to talk about that in a little while. Then you also have rights. People tend to think, well, I have rights for this and I have rights for that. And we do have some rights. It doesn't mean we have all rights. So how do we have how do we have two people that are actually advocating for what rights? Who is to say who gets what rights, what's going to be afforded to one person, what's going to be appropriated? How do we balance that, and who is actually going to determine that? Because it's extremely important. And then the next part of justice is the distribution. We talk about distribution. It has two subsets, but let me read what distribution means first. Distribution is the appropriate distribution of social benefits and penalties among contemporary parties, all right? So now, the first three, again, power, right? Then we have equity, who's going to actually benefit, right? Then the third one was rights. Then the fourth one we get here is distribution. So within distribution, you have two parts that we generally talk about. One is social justice, which is going to be more or less the theme tonight. And the second part is criminal justice. Now, when you define them, social justice is the fair share in society's goods and rewards, right? So what happens when someone is actually imprisoned? And how does that come about? Are the laws balanced between one having powder cocaine or one having crack cocaine, right? The sentencing is generally different and it's harsh depending upon which is which. You can advocate on both sides for that. The second part is criminal justice. Not subject to punishment or penalties unless they morally deserve them. I take you back, most of you may know about Khalid Brower. He was a young man who was 19 years old. He was actually locked up in Rikers Island for 3 years. I think he spent 2 years in solitary confinement. What happens when one is locked up in solitary confinement, it actually changes your brain structure. So mind you, have a 19-year-old young man whose mind and brain is still forming, for that matter, still forming, but he's locked up for 23 hours a day for 2 years. As you know, he was in jail for 3 years. He was in Rikers for 3 years, and then after delay, his case was finally dismissed. And the reason why he was in there, someone allegedly stated that he stole a backpack. And that's why he was picked up again, because he was on parole. And actually got out, won a case against the city, and unfortunately at 22 years old, he hung himself. So this is one of the extreme cases of social justice, or social justice inequity for that matter, okay? Now, there's other ways to look at justice too, right? It's how do we compete, looking at these four components, what's fair and not fair, okay? Or what is just and what's unjust. One could be this. A woman is pregnant. Is there a right to life or a right to choose? How do we arbitrate which is right? Furthermore, if you want to make the argument extended a bit, what about the man involved? Suppose he doesn't want the woman to have an abortion, and she wants to have an abortion. So now you got three things going on. You got possibly the right to life, right? She has a fetus, she's carrying it. She should bring it full term. Then on the opposite side of that, you have the aspect that this is her body. She could choose what she wants. Then you have the third party, which is the male figure that says, hey, well, maybe, you shouldn't have an abortion. If you don't want the baby, I'll take care of it. But how do we decide what's fair and what's not fair? See, so these are some of the dynamics that we got to work through. Another one is police brutality and or protection. I grew up in the South Bronx, right? And so for me, the police weren't there for protection. They were like an occupying force. And remember, the police aren't there to actually protect you per se. It's the property of the state. That's what they're actually hired to do, right? They're hired hands. And for those that don't know, the police had their origins in runaway slaves. So you actually think about the organization of the police was actually to capture those that actually escaped from plantations. But I digress. What about the other side to this? What about Eric Garner and Phileo Castillo? What about them? Is the other side is police brutality and excessive force. How do we arbitrate between these two? So we're always going back and forth. And on one side, people will say, well, the police are just. On the other side, they say they're unjust. How do we actually bring this together? See, that's our dilemma. The other side is we talk about racial issues. You have people that believe in, Southern heritage, right? So they want monuments up. They want to fly the Confederate flag at state houses. They actually have laws in place that you can't even remove the monuments in some places without state authorization. Then on the other side, people say, well, the flag, the emblems, the monuments are nothing more than symbols of racial oppression, right? And a recall to the bad days of yesterday in America, when America really wasn't great, when slavery ran rampant, and off of slavery, you also had Jim Crow. So when you think about all these things, who is to say what's right and what's wrong? Which brings us to even today. In the last, I think, 24, 48 hours, you had the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, state that the policy at the border is based on Romans chapter 13, right? And again, depending on how you argue it, the problem was there wasn't a representative democracy in place at that time. So, again, it depends on how you frame the argument. Also, what you're doing now, he's taking theological concepts and trying to fit them into a political frame. Actually, neither one would really correspond in that setting. But we're not here to talk about Jeff Sessions, so let me move on. So, we talk about justice. You got to look at it from the legal perspective. Legally and theologically, the short answer or the short meaning of justice is for one to be in their right standing, right? So here we have 4 different points talking about justice. This is from a legal perspective coming out of Black Law Dictionary. One is fairness. One is moral rightness. The third, a scheme or system of law in which every person receives his, her, or its due from the system, including all rights, both natural and legal. The fourth part, the constant and perpetual disposition to render every man, woman, entity its due. What I want you to really concentrate on is the second point. It says moral rightness. Now, those that are lawyers and those that went to law school know that the law is taught in an amoral fashion. If you're not supposed to actually weigh morality when one is trying to either make law or interpret law. Well, we'll get into that in a few minutes. Next slide, please. But there's something even better than the justice system we have now, than the concept of justice that I spoke about. From our viewpoint is biblical justice. We're going to look at biblical justice from a Hebraic mindset, which is actually, there's 5 components to it, okay? Since, first one, thank you. First one is shalom, right? Sabbath shalom, right? But and as Pastor Donald always stated, we think of peace, we shouldn't think of it in a very limited sense. Peace is much broader than actually how we lay it out. It's actually the presence of harmony, the second point, and wholeness, of health and prosperity, of integration and balance. Let's key on harmony for a second. I'm not a singer, I can't sing. I'm not a musician, so I'm not going to do either, but I do understand the difference between melody and harmony. One can actually, a melody to a song, you could hum it, that's fine. But actually to create harmony, you actually have to have 2 people to come together, right? So you can't really have peace by yourself. Peace has to be broken within community. It's not an alone thing. That's why it says presence of harmony, which are bringing 2 or more parties not to live together in a kumbaya fashion. What they're coming together is try to live, in some type of, to bring some organization to the chaos that's around us. That's peace from a Hebraic perspective. So if you go down to the last point, it says soundness in our relationships with God, with each other, nature, and with ourselves. So basically, it's how we relate. It's not more or less me sitting in the corner, but it's how I relate at my job, it's how I'm relating in the setting now, it's how I'm going to relate to my wife later when we go to dinner. It's all of these different interactions. Are they all peaceful, and what does that mean? Does it mean there's an absence of tension? No. Remember what Dr. King said. He said peace is not the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice. That's more of a fitting meaning of peace in a very concise sense. And we'll talk about how justice and righteousness actually interact together at one point. Then we have covenant. Okay, so what happens in biblical justice is a covenant relationship is formed. And whenever you have a formal relationship that's a covenant relationship, it's going to bind the parties to what is specified in that agreement and how they should act. They should act accordingly. The second one is the conditions of the relationship. Right? What are the conditions to any relationship? What's the condition to my marriage relationship? What is the conditions to playing in the NFL? Now, some make issue that the NFL policy was too harsh. So I was in class the other day teaching it's a political class. A retired attorney asked me what were my feelings in regards to the NFL's policy. So I told absence of my feelings is that the players have engaged in a social contract with the employer. I said, now if the employer states that you can't do something in order to be employed by that person, then you can't do it. And I gave her an example. About 25 years ago, I was fresh out of college, first real job, I'm ready to go. So, I'm working in a predominantly white area in a predominantly white office. There's only 2 African Americans in the whole office, right? So one day I just wanted to, let my inner Malcolm X come out. So I wore a goatee to work, right? So what ended up happening, my boss called me in the office. So he said, what's going on? I was like, everything's fine, what are you talking about? He said, what's that under your chin? I'm like, facial hair. He said, then that's not allowed. He said, plus you already have enough to contend with. That was his response to me. So now I had a choice. Do I rebel and stand up for my, the Nation of Islam, or do I shave off my goatee and remain employed and I can still have those feelings, I just don't have to wear it to work. So my response to her was this, that the players in this political game of chess have to be, they have to be strategic. Maybe they just don't come out on the field. It's not about how I feel. It's an operation manual that's not policy, that can't be negotiated through collective bargaining, but it's one of the conditions to maintain proper status in the NFL. Okay? Let me keep going. Now let's talk about the Torah. Now, the Torah is the Hebrew word for instruction, right? So what happens, you have the 10 sayings. As Pastor Donna told us, they're not the 10 commandments. So they're the 10 sayings. From there, everything else grew out of that. So you had 613 laws, basically. It was the 10 sayings, and then what they did, they added on 603 instructions, in which one was to govern their life. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But look at this. Look at the second point. It's God's instruction in righteousness. That's the main thing here. Again, you can't have justice and righteousness. You could actually change these. You could say it is God's instruction in justice. So they're really connected. You'll see that God in His Word uses them interchangeably. Okay. Then you have the law. The law of God involves legislation, but it's not law how we see it. When we look at the law like U.S. law, it's totally different. All laws we know is divided from 2 documents. One is the Constitution, which I think you should read if you haven't. Very important document. I don't agree with everything in there, but it's an important document. The second one is the addendum to the Constitution, which is the Bill of Rights. The Constitution was ratified in 1777, if I'm not mistaken, 1787. The Bill of Rights was ratified in 1791. I actually was reading them this week. If you haven't read them, I suggest you read them. But biblical law isn't set up like that. Biblical law is more inclusive. It's actually God's mandate in how we should act to each other. Last point here, it details what life looks like, right? In covenant, see, I just connected the covenant again, relationship with God, along with precedent, circumstance, and oral tradition. That's where you get, the Levitical sayings and things in the Midrash that Pastor Donna talks about a lot. So all this is inclusive. Again, this is only another component of looking at justice from a biblical or Hebraic mindset. The next one is looking at deeds and consequences. We know that whatever we do has a reaction and a reaction, right? That the old saying is, whatever you do indirectly or directly affects someone else, that we just don't act without any consequences. So in God's word, you have, if you act righteousness or you act justly, there's blessings, there's a connection. Then the opposite to that is sin and disaster, right? Sin, which is missing the mark, actually leads to disaster, right? So you can read on your own. Look at Proverbs 13:21. When you have a chance, it really, balances this out. Proverbs is a great read. It's actually about learning how to skillfully live. That's what Proverbs is basically about. You go to the second point, is that God is ultimately involved in our actions and their consequences. Sometimes we think that God doesn't care about us. We may be going through something. Things aren't working out at the job. I got health challenges. I got challenges within my faith community. I got family issues. Does God really hear me and understand me? And is he there? God is there. He's present. The spiritual world is as real as the world in which we see. We just don't see it. But we have to act like it's that real. God may seem like he's distant, but he's really only a prayer away, and he's in his word. So whenever we all have those feelings. We feel this, we're remote, he's not hearing us. We may not even be feeling him, right, for that matter. But God is always present. He's intimately involved. He cares about us. If he knitted us together in our mother's womb, he's interested in our day-to-day life. Whatever that may be, wherever you may be at in your development and your maturity. The last part is we cannot escape the consequences of our actions because they're connected to our freedom, right? I teach at Rikers Island on Thursday nights with the young men. And so basically, we don't ask them whatever they did. That's none of our business. Sometimes you get close enough to them, they'll willingly tell you. So based on whatever action they took outside of the criminal justice system being unbalanced and unfair and unjust, they'll actually start to tell you what led them there, right? And again, we're not making any judgments on that, but they understand because of what society has prescribed is acceptable behavior, and they stood outside of those bounds for whatever reason, that this is the consequence. Same thing with us. We may not get locked up, but sin unchecked in our lives actually puts us in a prison. And to look at that, look at King David. If you recall, when David didn't confess with Bathsheba, and that went on for several months, David said he felt distant, that he was, his bones are drying up. He used it metaphorically that he was basically dry and arid, basically within his soul. That's because that's what happened with sin. That's what happens with sin. This partake, this break, this missing God's mark of righteousness causes the distance. But again, God is interested in us. He wants us to come back home, and that's when we confess and come back to him. So now, I think by saying all of that, and that was a lot, I thought it would be better to actually present it in a pie chart. Because within a pie chart, you actually see it. Now, again, the weight here is based on my own determination. Nothing is more than anything else. I just did it because I think it looks better, or we can see it visually this way. So as you can see, you can even change this just from a Hebraic perspective. Again, these 5 principles. It's covenant, it's the Torah, it's shalom, it's our deeds and consequences, and there's one part I'm sorry I missed, which is atonement or forgiveness. That part, when we look at that, the easy way to remember atonement is at one with God. At one with God, right? So what happens, we have to atone for the things we've done wrong, right? And whatever that may be, that's confession to God. It may be confession to someone else. Maybe confession to your best friend that you may have cursed out by accident on a bad day, right? I'm just saying. But whatever that may be, we have to make these relationships right. And see, so that's where atonement and forgiveness comes in. Okay? So you have that there. So again, we're constantly doing these things. We're constantly trying to make this right. And this is the framework for biblical justice. Okay? Let's go on. Next slide. Now, when you look at justice, you also got to look at it in another way. You got to look at it from the Old Testament or Hebraic scriptures viewpoint and from the New Testament. On the Old Testament side, justice was God redeeming Israel from enslavement in Egypt, right? And you're looking at 400 years. So by God putting them in their right standing, he basically delivered justice to the Hebrews through his own acts and power. And if you notice, that's one of the repeated stories throughout all of the prophets. They talk about that. Even talking about it in the New Testament, this sense of justice, God putting the nation of Israel, the Hebraic tribe, in their right standing. On the flip side of that, you have the New Testament. Now the same thing happens. It's actually Christ, Joshua, if you want to say his name for the Hebrew. His name actually means God saves, right? So if you want to look at it in totality, what God did on the cross, he literally saved us from the penalty of sin. And what he did, he now justified us. He put us in our right standing. So even before we go back into social justice, the main thing is to understand that biblical justice actually incorporates the redemption not only of our soul and our physical bodies, it also incorporates the whole person. Same thing happened in the New Testament. When we entered in this new covenant with Christ, everything became new. Now, the word new in the New Testament, it is like you got a new shirt or a new pair of shoes. It's something radically different. It's like a new design, something that was never in play before. It's just like when the new heaven and the new earth that Pastor Donna talked about, when she was talking about Revelation in the new heaven, it's something totally different, something we actually can't imagine. So this is the new covenant that Christ brought us into. This is justice. This is biblical justice. It supersedes man's justice. Why? Because it's including the whole person. It's not one person benefiting at the expense of another person, right? When police tend to kill people, they tend to be let go. Why? Because of the state laws are set up in 99% of our states that they can't be held accountable. So when outside protesting against police brutality, it's never going to be just because the laws in place are unjust. And we're going to talk about just and unjust laws in a second. Okay, so what about social justice? This is what we're here to talk about, right? So you look at social justice, right? It's biblical justice stems from God and thus has an objective existence. It's not really partial to how I'm feeling, to what I'm thinking, but it's really outside of me. But it actually includes me at the same time. The second part, biblical justice deals with the personal and the social. Look at this. The public and the private. The political and the human. And non-human, right? We have a dog here. Thereby affecting the whole person from a social perspective, right? So it's everything. It's not this, it's not an either or, but it's inclusive of everything. That's what we talk about when we talk about biblical justice. And so now we get to social justice. Look here. Social justice begins and ends with the gospel of God. Now understand, I didn't say the gospel of Christ, even though Christ came to share the good news. The good news of God is that one, he redeemed the nation of Israel, put them in their right standing, and then Christ in the New Testament, for those that accept him as Lord and Savior, he puts us in our right standing. So therefore, the 2/3 of the Godhead were concerned about justice. The whole person, not a half a person, not a part of a person, not 3/5 of a person if you read the Constitution, but the whole person. Okay, we're going to talk about Isaiah. We're going to look at 3 scriptures before we close. Okay? But before I do that, I want to backtrack for a second. I talked about just laws and unjust laws. And I want to put this in perspective because you can have laws that can be unjust and just. And if you read Letter from a Birmingham Jail, which is a masterpiece, I suggest you read it. Dr. King wrote in 1963. He argues that an unjust law is no law at all. Why? If the law doesn't square with God's natural law, right? So this is how laws are looked at, right? Just laws derive from God. God is just, and his mandate for conduct make for just laws, the 10 sayings in the Torah. Unjust laws on the other side, all laws can be just or unjust, resting upon a derivative from God's natural law or the denial of our depravity. Okay? Now, what makes a law unjust? Well, if you go back a year, when the demonstrations were still in full force against police brutality, and those that in various chapters were leading them in the Black Lives Matter movement across the country, the legislative body of North Carolina decided to put a bill on the floor. And the bill was such, it didn't pass, the bill was such that if I'm driving home and demonstrators flood the interstate highway or any street, I can actually run them over and not be held accountable, right? So that means if there was a demonstration in New York City and people just didn't have a permit for whatever reason, and they flood the streets, you can literally run them over at 34th Street, and that's fine. Is that a just law or an unjust law? It didn't pass, so I guess people they reasoned, the consensus was it was an unjust bill, so it didn't pass. The other part about just laws and unjust laws, just laws do not violate the righteous standard for justice, okay? God doesn't go back on those concepts that make for justice. They're always in play, and they're fixed. They're not changeable. That's how God does justice. On our side, unjust laws break with the code of conduct for God's just standing. Voter suppression laws, where parties are actually injured, but not all of the parties particularly may be in that state, right? Or what about the immigration debate we're having now at the southern border? If you notice, the president and people that support him are saying they're following the law. Actually, they're not following the law. They're following a policy. See, so we got to understand that when they use the word law, that's actually they're not following it, but understand they're trying to use the law for unjust means. Actually, the law actually states that those seeking asylum with their children should actually be together, and we're pulling them apart. So the administration is actually acting unjustly, and regardless of how Attorney Sessions tried to reason, he can't reason that way. It doesn't work. And first, it's not biblical either, and nor is it legal from a legal standpoint. But nonetheless, this is what they're doing based on policy. But let's get back here. Let's talk about Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, for those that know about the book of Isaiah, it's the only book from antiquity that's actually been found in its complete set, all 66 books. If you go to Jerusalem and you go to the museum, they actually have it in the Jerusalem Museum, if I'm not mistaken. I can't remember the name, I went there 20 years ago. But nonetheless, the wonderful part about the book of Isaiah, it's set up almost like the Old and New Testament, right? 39 books, people say, represent the Old Testament, and the other 27 actually represent the New Testament, okay? So here we're looking at the Old Testament side, which is this is coming from 32, 16, and 17. Here, the first part of the book is really talking about the doom that the nation was under, right? That, they were plagued, the kingdom had split up because of disobedience of Solomon, right? So broke up under Solomon, things of that sort. And then the prophets are speaking of that in the succeeding books. Well, here the scripture reads, "Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness abide in the fruitful field. The effect of righteousness will be peace, and the result of righteousness, quietness and trust forever." Think about that. Then justice will dwell in the wilderness, and righteousness abide in the fruitful field. The effect, think about this, the effect of righteousness will be peace, total peace, complete peace and harmony on all sides. And the result of righteousness, quietness and trust forever. That's what happens when justice is in play. When we really are operating in a just manner to ourselves, to people around us, and society, this can actually happen. Of course, it probably won't happen until Christ comes again. But nonetheless, those of us that are foot soldiers should be fighting for this to happen. Now, this is the book of Amos, right? It's actually on Dr. King's tombstone, if I'm not mistaken. If you go down to Atlanta, you always quoted this. And again, do you see how this justice and righteousness are always mentioned together? It says, "But let justice roll down like waters, and righteous like an ever-flowing stream." Now let's step back for a second. The book that it comes from, this guy was actually like a farmer, right? And the book is really about holding up to a standard. Use this for paper. See, When construction, when those that do engineering construction, when they generally build a building or they're putting up a wall, they use a plumb line. So basically, the book of Amos is saying, actually it's a good book because he's actually going against the status quo religious leaders of his day and those that were rich and privileged, right? So basically what's happening there is, in the book, he's holding a plumb line up. What was God's standard and what was the nation of Israel doing? So basically, if you're going to line up with God's just standard and be right by him, you shouldn't be bending or crooked. Amos is actually calling them out by not being aligned with God, not being parallel with his word. Okay, that's the backdrop to the book. Okay, but again, it says, but let justice roll like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. You can't have justice without having righteousness, because the definition of justice is to put someone in their right standing. So it's always laced in the Bible. So even when we argue from a legal viewpoint about, what's just, what's right, it actually comes out from biblical mind frame, a mindset. Now the last verse we're going to look at tonight, this is a verse for you to meditate on over the Sabbath. It's the book of Micah. And if you go to the background to the book, it's actually is God having his day in court, right? God's the judge, and he's going to charge the nation of Israel and all the other nations, to act accordingly. But interesting what it says here. What I want you to notice in this verse, there are actually 3 verbs here. But let's read it. He has shown you, O mortal, or mankind for that matter, what is good. And what does the Lord, or Adonai, right, or Yahweh, depending upon the translation, require of you? 3 things. Look at this. The first one's to act justly, going back to justice, right? So that's a verb. It's not a noun, it's a verb. And it says, and to love mercy. To love is actually, we got to do this thing, right? To love mercy. And to walk humbly with your God. Now, to walk is actually to live out loud, to walk humbly. If you look at humbly from a Latin perspective, it literally means the ground, right? It's a matter of, it's a humble state. I generally like to pray face down because it's hard for me to look down on other people when I have my face to the ground. And literally worship, one of the words for worship is actually to kiss the ground. And so this is how we should live our lives. Not that we are humble to the degree that people walk over us, but we're able to think less of ourselves so we can think, of other people. So again, the verse says we got to do 3 things, folks. Those that are the Sabbath collective family. You got to act justly, right? So this is what we do. We want to always try to act in the right manner. We want to love mercy when mercy is due. And we're going to have to extend that to people sometimes, even when they don't deserve it, right? That's part of this walk. Even the guy Joe, who I told you about earlier, I had to extend some mercy to him. Because at the end of our conversation, he tried to get me to become a Donald Trump fan. So I had to extend mercy to him, right? And I told him that would never happen, but we had a good conversation nonetheless. But the other part is, we need to walk humbly. Let humility be our guide. And a great book to read if you want to study something about humility is the book of Philippians. It's all about humility. That Christ emptied himself out, taking on the form of a man, to actually go to the cross, to actually, go to the right hand of the Father. That's looking at Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 11, if you're going like this in Christ's life. Heaven, he sinks down and he comes up. But it's a book about humility, and that's what we all need more of. I need more of it. But it's not walking around with your head down. What it actually means is you're going to be able to control your strength. That's what it means. You're going to be able to speak when you need to speak. Be quiet when you need to speak. Be quiet. Take a stand when you need to take a stand. So as we close out tonight, I charge you to be an advocate for social justice. Whatever that may look like for you. It could be environmental pollution. It could be economic disparities. It could be a number of things. But I charge you with actually doing it. I'm going to try to do my part, and I need you to do your part. Because as Andre said, always states, and he has that shirt, it doesn't have to be this way. We can do better, and I'm committed to doing better, and I hope you join me in doing so. Thank you. Have a blessed weekend. Shabbat Shalom. Okay? Wow, it's 40 minutes.